Freddie Roach trained Mike Tyson towards the end of Mike Tyson's career. He was with him for, I think it was 2 fights. It was either 1 or 2 fights. He was definitely with him for the Danny Williams fight. He may have also been with him for the Clifford Etienne fight. He also, a lot of people may not realize, briefly trained Wladimir Klitschko. I believe it was after Klitschko's loss to Lamont Brewster. Anyway, there's an interesting interview on YouTube, which I'll leave a link to in the description below, in which Freddie Roach is talking about a time when Mike Tyson knocked him out, when Freddie Roach took him on the pads. And he's also talking about Mike Tyson's punching power, comparing it to Wladimir Klitschko's punching power. Unsurprisingly to me, he basically says in the video that Wladimir Klitschko hits harder than Mike Tyson. Freddie Roach has said on several occasions in the past that Wladimir Klitschko is the hardest punching fighter he's ever worked with. There seems to be this bizarre cult-like, religious-like belief with Mike Tyson among his fans that he is the hardest puncher that's ever lived. Mike Tyson was a 5'10", 217-pound fighter in his prime. The idea that a guy that small could hit harder than all of the 250-pound heavyweights out there today is so stupid, it's unreal. Of course, Wladimir Klitschko hits harder than Mike Tyson. There are many heavyweights that hit harder than Mike Tyson. Tyson's power was very, very good, particularly for a guy of his size. But it was, and it still is, very overrated. When I say overrated, that's not to say he don't hit hard. He obviously hit very hard. But he was nowhere near as devastating a puncher as a lot of his fans will make out. There are plenty of opponents who went the distance with Tyson. There are plenty of opponents who he didn't knock out that had been knocked out previously. James Tillis, for example. When you're talking about 250-pound men like Wladimir Klitschko, who can punch, it's not like he's just a big man. No, he's a big, very athletic man who punches very correctly, who punches very hard, who's in tremendous condition. He's pure muscle. And there are some people arguing that Freddie Roach is talking rubbish and Tyson don't hit as hard as Klitschko. Honestly, people, quit the fanboy BS. Of course, Klitschko hits harder than Tyson. Some people have said, well, Tyson was towards the end of his career, so he weren't hitting that hard when he was with Roach. He was hitting plenty hard. Power is the last thing to go. Mike Tyson was able to score the number of knockouts he did, particularly early knockouts, because, as I've said many times before, he was a prolific puncher. Prolific meaning he had a knack, he had an ability to be able to land his power punches consistently on his opponents and therefore produce knockouts. There are many fighters out there who don't necessarily have a high KO percentage, but they do have tremendous punching power. Kendall Holt is a good example. Tim Bradley said Kendall Holt, I'm not sure if he's changed now, but for a long time in his career, he said Kendall Holt was the hardest puncher he ever faced. He said Kendall Holt hit a lot harder than Pacquiao. Kendall Holt has got less than a 50% KO ratio. There are many other fighters as well who've said that Kendall Holt was a tremendous puncher when they faced him. But yet very few KOs, because you may have a tremendous punch, you may have tremendous power, but you might not have the ability and the skill to be able to land that power on your opponent's chin on a consistent basis, fight after fight. You might be able to hit the heavy bag extremely hard, but when you get in the ring against an opponent who's hitting you back and making you worry about not getting hit, and who's moving around, making it difficult for you to get the timing and the angle and everything correct, then it's a lot more difficult to land your shots and a lot more difficult to detonate your bomb. Just because you have a high KO ratio is not necessarily an indication that you're punch for punch, the hardest puncher out there. For example, Vitaly Klitschko has a higher KO ratio than his brother Wladimir, but all of the mutual opponents that they've faced say that Wladimir hits a lot harder than Vitaly, despite the fact Vitaly has a higher KO ratio. Vitaly was a more prolific puncher than Wladimir, yes. But in terms of one-punch power, Vladimir's got much more one-punch power than Vitaly ever had. With Mike Tyson, he was very fast in his prime. Very fast. He'd be able to catch opponents by surprise with punches. And that, combined with the good power that he had, was able to produce the knockouts that he produced. He was also able to overwhelm opponents with the sheer speed and ferocity of his attacks, like with Frank Bruno. In both fights, he didn't knock Bruno out with one punch. He overwhelmed Bruno with a blistering barrage in both fights. You look at the finish in the first fight. Tyson was all over Bruno, throwing dozens and dozens of punches. Bruno wouldn't go down in that fifth round. So, this myth that Tyson can hit harder than everybody today is just so stupid. I'm telling you right now, and people are really going to start crying about this. I'm telling you now, even somebody like David Price probably hits harder than Tyson. I'm telling you, people. You're talking about giant men who hit very hard. And you reckon this little 217-pound, 5'10" guy is punch for punch hitting harder than them? Don't be silly. Of course these giant guys are hitting harder than Tyson. They might not be as prolific punchers as him. They might not be able to catch opponents by surprise the way that he was because they don't have the speed. Tyson was also a very correct puncher. So when he lands on you, he was going to land with the knuckle part of the glove. He was going to get all his leverage onto it and be able to do it very quickly in the blink of an eye. Very correct puncher. Wasn't a crude clubbing puncher. The guy punched very correctly. Bang on your chin. Bang on your temple in the vital areas. Okay, there may be guys out there. There are guys out there who have more brute force behind their punches than Tyson, but they're nowhere near as accurate. And so therefore, they're not able to surprise the opponents or be as prolific in terms of producing knockouts. So, yeah. How big do heavyweights have to get? How powerful do they have to get before Mike Tyson fans come to the realization that Tyson is not the biggest puncher of all time? And it don't have to be a choice between Tyson, Shavers, and Foreman. No, there are many other guys out there that hit harder than all of them. Guys you probably haven't even heard of that are, fringe contenders or journeymen who weren't particularly good, who didn't have that much skill, who weren't able to land their big punches on a consistent basis. But if you stood in front of them and they were able to unleash their best shot, they would hit you as hard or harder than anybody. George Chuvalo is a guy who fought George Foreman, Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, many people. And he lists two other guys who I can't remember their names off the top of my head who hit just as hard as George Foreman that he fought. Guys who most of you have never heard of before. And he said they hit just as hard as Foreman. Harder than Frazier. But yet you've never heard of the guys. Several fighters, including Oliver McCall, who was Mike Tyson's chief sparring partner for several years. He said that Burt Cooper, who he also sparred with, hit him and hurt him in sparring. And he said that Cooper hit him a lot harder than Mike Tyson ever did. Burt Cooper in a professional fight hurt Evander Holyfield far more than Mike Tyson ever did. Far more than George Foreman ever did. Burt Cooper was a journeyman. Burt Cooper didn't have an amazing KO percentage. Burt Cooper wasn't that good. But he had terrific punching power. Let me tell you that. Didn't always have the skill to land them big bombs. But if you stood in front of him at the right moment, at the right time, and he caught you, he'd hit you as hard or harder than just about anybody that you've been in the ring with. Ask Holyfield. Ask Oliver McCall. So this is the reality of it, people. People get caught up in names and mystique and all this type of stuff, and they think that, well, because Tyson is this ferocious fighter who was known for knockouts and who was such a dominant champion during his first reign, it automatically means that because he was so good as a fighter, he's automatically a harder puncher than all these other fighters. It don't work like that, people. I keep telling you. The top guy in the division at any given time, who may be the biggest puncher in the division at that time, well, who may be the most prolific puncher in the division at the time, don't necessarily mean he has the most one-punch power. No. It could be some random journeyman. Look at Darnell Boone, for God's sake. Darnell Boone is clearly a tremendous puncher. He don't have the skill to be able to land his big punch on a consistent basis. But for the size of him, and really Darnell Boone is a small middleweight, and yet he's fought super middleweights, light heavyweights, etc. He dropped, and you know what, I'm going to try to get an interview with Darnell Boone and ask him about this. But he apparently dropped Sergey Kovalev several times when they fought the first time and had him seriously hurt. He also knocked out Adonis Stevenson and nearly knocked out Andre Ward. And this is a guy who's a small middleweight who don't have a great KO percentage. But clearly he hits very hard. If he can catch you at the right moment, he'll hit you as hard as anybody you've been in the ring with. In most cases, all right? There are some fighters who may have fought harder punches than Darnell Boone, definitely. But a lot of fighters who will tell you that Darnell Boone was ridiculously powerful. Despite the fact he is, a journeyman level fighter who never really achieved world honors or anything like that, clearly the guy can bang. This is the reality of boxing, people. Yeah, there are loads of heavyweights throughout history who, in terms of raw power, hit harder than Tyson. And there are plenty of guys around today in the heavyweight division who hit harder than Tyson. Oh yes, I know you're going to cry and scream about it in the comment section, some of you Tyson fans, but this is the reality. It don't mean they're better fighters than Tyson. Evidently not, in most cases. But in terms of one-punch power, yup, plenty of guys hit harder than Mike. Have a look at the Freddie Roach interview. Do some research of your own if you don't concur with what I'm saying. And look up fighters who have fought Tyson who tell you that he's not the hardest puncher they fought. When Freddie Roach did train Tyson, Tyson was at the end of his career, but power is the last thing to go. Tyson wasn't as fast as he was earlier on in his career, but Tyson himself, after he came out of prison, I remember reading the Ring magazine and KO magazine, Mike Tyson special editions after he came out of prison, and very clearly remember Tyson saying that he's hitting harder now than he was before prison. Yep, Tyson himself, in his own words, said he was hitting harder after prison, not just harder, much harder after he came out of prison than he was when he went into prison, which is understandable because Tyson's body was still maturing, as most people's bodies do in their late 20s, early 30s. Tyson was probably physically, in fact, I'm sure Tyson was physically stronger in his late 20s, early 30s than he was in his, early 20s, mid 20s. Physically stronger and hitting harder. Now, obviously, the period that he trained with Roach was really at the end of his career. I think he was like 38 when he trained with Roach. But believe you me, he was still hitting extremely hard. Didn't have the speed that he used to, but was still pretty quick and still hitting very hard. But Wladimir hit harder. Don't be shocked, people. Anyway, it's your boy Hatman, I'm out.